it was predictable that he would embarrass me, and so I'm just embarrassed, and I'm supposed to, yeah, very good. Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure and privilege to be here. First time I'm at AMEE conference, and I'm very impressed. Not just by the numbers, but particularly by the spirit. I'm gonna talk about medical expertise. I think that when we think about medical education, we need to put it in a broader context of what is happening to medical work and medical expertise, and what is the historical transformation that we are part of at the moment. So this will be the basic scope of what I'm trying to do. This, of course, means that I can only provide some broad claims and outlines, not the detailed, empirically based exercise. But I think that also in the symposium, for instance, that follows later this morning, which is devoted to activity theory and medical education, there would be a chance to go deeper also in empirical cases. The challenge, as I see it, is that physicians today must function as members of complex social systems in which they work to support the health of their patients. This has been recently described as systems-based practice, including advocacy and collaboration. And I think these notions are going to be increasingly pervasive, that being a physician practicing medicine is increasingly a systems endeavor. In the US, systems-based practice is described as a core competency which requires residents to demonstrate an awareness of and responsiveness to the larger context and system of healthcare, as well as the ability to call effectively on other resources in the system to provide optimal healthcare. In other words, the message is you can't do it alone, and it's not enough that you have a few friends. You have to understand and be able to make the system move. In the similar vein, in Canada, the expected competencies of physicians are now to work as a part of a broader system or collective in the daily practice. And I think we can see more of this kind of language developing also at the level of policy making. But being a sort of systems-based practitioner is not straightforward and simple. In fact, it's very contradictory, because there is a foundational change going on in the overall object of medicine. The growth of chronic illness, especially chronic multimorbidity, is something that is going on all over the world, and at the same time we're becoming increasingly aware that poverty both generates ill health and restricts or denies access to health care for those who most desperately need it. And I think that these are time bombs which are not much smaller than what we are witnessing when we talk about climate change. It is a question about sustainability of life from another angle. Traditional conceptualizations of multimorbidity should be expanded to take into account the complexities of co-occurrence between mental illness, chronic medical conditions, and poverty. This requires radical expansion of the object of medicine. It requires longer time perspectives, broader collaborative and interdisciplinary approaches, and transformative agency from medical practitioners and their organizations. However, the rules of medicine are increasingly penetrated by market-oriented business calculations and managerialism that favor rapid turnover and short-term profits. And the instruments of medicine are increasingly framed in terms of rationalization, standardization, and commoditization. Again, notions that favor linear and prepackaged processes and procedures rather than horizontally co-constructed care trajectories and long-term impact. These forces make the needed expansion of the object of medicine very, very difficult. Using some activity theoretical terms, this contradictory situation may be depicted and analyzed with the help of images like this. And here we come to, let's say, difficulties. Because if one starts to take the system seriously, it's not quick and easy. An activity system, as we like to think of it, consists at least of the following components. There is the subject, in this case the medical practitioner, and there is an object. In this case it would be, broadly speaking, multimorbidity, poverty in their complex interactions. And the subject works with instruments, and they are at the moment pervaded by rationalization, standardization, and commoditization very much. And the rules of managerialism and marketization are very strongly influencing the activity system. So those red little arrows indicate contradictions in the system. Now, contradictions may sound bad, but they are a necessary part of any activity. There is no such thing as a happy, non-contradictory activity. But it means that we need to understand those contradictions in order to influence and direct the development of the activity. In activity theory, you talk about the zone of proximal development. So we don't like to talk about specific goals that must be achieved by a certain point in time. Because usually what happens is that you achieve something else. Zone refers to an area that you need to be able to master and cross, and there are many pathways across it. Contradictions generate disturbances and conflicts in everyday medical work, but they also generate mundane innovations and local change efforts, which are equally important to understand. And these point to the necessity of transforming our notion of medical expertise. The zone of proximal development means that what is historically possible needs to be somehow understood. A zone of proximal development is a contested terrain between the present and the future. It can be crossed and charted by multiple interweaving trails and paths, and indeed that's the only way to build the future. At the moment, I like to think about the zone of proximal development of medical expertise in roughly these terms. The vertical dimension represents the movement from the individual locus of expertise toward collective expertise. And the horizontal dimension represents movement from learning for stability, for well-defined pre-existing procedures and skills, toward learning that requires mastery of constant change. And if you think about expertise, you can identify different prototypical modes of expertise. On the lower left-hand field, you see the classical starting point of medical work, understood as craft. A movement upward to a collective locus, but still focused on stability, leads to various forms of bureaucratic notions of expertise, hierarchical, and movement toward the right, toward embracing change, but sticking to the individual locus, leads to various forms of market-based expertise. The difficulty is, how do you combine both the learning for change and collective locus of expertise? How can something be collective and flexible at the same time? And I suggest 3 spearheads that should be examined, that may actually open up pathways toward a collaborative and transformative expertise. The first one, in the middle, is the understanding of expertise in terms of object and contradiction-driven activity systems. The second one I call not working. Doesn't mean not working, but not working with a K. And the third one I call expansive learning. Each one of those is a theoretical concept that would require quite a bit of explanation and study, so I have to gloss over them quite quickly, hopefully at least whetting your appetite to perhaps look into them a bit more thoroughly. So the key qualities of collaborative and transformative expertise consist of agentive participation in continuous systemic transformation of practice, which can only be accomplished by means of collaboration among practitioners and coalition building between medicine, its target communities, and other societal actors. So this is my basic argument. Now, the 3 spearheads. First of all, expertise as object-oriented and contradiction-driven activity systems. I understand activity as a collective and durable system that generates goal-directed actions. So the distinction between activity and action is of foundational importance. If you perform an operation on a patient, that's an action or a bundle of actions. But there will be the next patient and the next patient, and the activity goes on. And when you retire, it still goes on. In other words, an activity is something which has very long half-life, whereas actions tend to be relatively finite, short. And the distinction is very important. If you only see actions, you lose sight of why you're doing what you're doing. There's even a third level, which we call operations, which are the more or less automatic components of an action. And of course, sometimes we see managers who would like to turn practitioners into mere conductors of operations, a bit in the spirit of Charlie Chaplin's assembly line. Well, Charlie didn't stand it, and human beings don't. Object is a key concept for understanding activity. It's different from goal. It's the long-term purpose of the activity, and it opens a horizon of possible actions. Horizon is an important metaphor, because if you try to reach the horizon, it always escapes you. And that's with, if the object, general object of medical work is health and illness, you can't complete it. It is not something that can be finished. It is multifaceted and constantly under construction. A general object, for instance, health and illness, is different from its situated instantiations. Every single patient represents the object with a specificity that requires special attention. Now, however, every action on a specific object feeds into and molds also the general object. We make history in our every small action. And finally, contradictions. These are historically accumulated systemic tensions within and between the nodes of the activity system. And like I already said, they're foundational. Basically, they're our friends, although they are very painful. Now, at the moment, what we see, especially when we look at multimorbidity and chronic illness in its various forms, we see fragmentation of care. The object becomes bits and pieces, different practitioners, different specialists see different angles, different aspects of the object. This is just an example of one patient's different caregivers involved in the care and the different ways they formulated the object. The patient himself said, I had lots of troubles with breathing during nighttime. The city hospital says, oh, he's got diabetes type 2. His personal general practitioner says, I have written that the patient has diabetes, kidney disease, etc., cardiac insufficiency, high level of cholesterol, etc. And then the specialists in the Helsinki University Hospital talk about cardiac insufficiency or sleeping apnea, kidney insufficiency. All of them have their own object. The patient says, who's going to keep this all together? And the patient says, I've become basically a mailman between these people. I try to carry the messages. The problem is that I don't understand the messages themselves. So I write down in a little blue notebook, and I try to read it for the next doctor, but they are not particularly interested. Everybody writes, nobody reads. It's a little bit like the classic situation with the Finnish policemen, that they have to be always in pairs, because one of them knows how to write, the other one knows how to read. In medicine, however, the situation is worse, because nobody seems to read. Everybody writes, and there's a lot of text. Here's another example. In our work, what we often do, we follow patients for quite lengthy periods of time to try to reconstruct their care trajectories in different kind of timescales. And we follow them to these consultations, these meetings with their caregivers, and try to understand what is happening, how the object is actually fragmented, and how it might be brought back together, expanded. Here's a concrete little example. We speak Finnish, but the text is in English here. So.
Hänen kanssa kun kahdestaan ollaan, niin tulee sitten se, että se on niinku pakko pysyä hengissä ja niitä munuaisia niinku kaikin mahdollisin kostein suojella ja varjella, että saisi hänet niinku aikuisesti.
The patient is speaking and she says, my husband died of cancer and my daughter is now 16. Being just the two of us, I feel I have to stay alive and protect my kidney, the remaining kidney, by all possible means to bring her up into adulthood. So that's what causes stress for me. And then I ask, so the problem is uncertainty in acute situations, whether or not information has been passed from one doctor to the other. And the patient said, yes, if I cannot convey the information myself, like it was in that particular situation recently, when she was brought to hospital unconscious, I was not able to explain my situation. That's something I have thought about many times. And that's a very basic worry and concern. Sometimes the patients that we bring into these situations are ready to be very emotional, crack down, even blame. And for the physicians, it's very important that they cannot blame the patient, because the patient is right there. They have to reconfigure what is being done together. Fragmentation of care is not generated by ill will. It's generated by systemic contradictions between and within activity systems. Minimally, we can think of the activity systems of specialized hospital care, primary care, general practice, and the patient's own life activity. Each have a somewhat different object. And these objects do not necessarily align. So if we think about the object, which is right there in the middle in the circle, for the patient, it's his or her own ill health. For the hospital specialists, it's a specific disease. And for the general practitioner, it's somehow the patient's overall health situation. How to align and construct genuinely common ground between these is the challenge. But it's not enough to see the different objects. Each of the three activity systems operates with specific instruments which limit their grasp of the object. A patient with multiple illnesses demands instruments that are shared by the three activity systems. And this is something that is lacking. In the case of the hospital specialists, their primary instruments today, I would say, are care pathways, or you might have different names for this in different cultures, but their diagnosis is specific. In primary care, in the settings that we have studied in Finland, they don't talk about care pathways, they talk about care relationships. And the idea is that there is a care relationship which is durable, longitudinal, but it's limited to primary care. These two sets of instruments are radically different, and there is hardly any dialogue between them. And then there is the patient, who's got all kinds of ad hoc information. Some of them become very good at storing all kinds of bits and pieces of medical information. Some of them are avid readers of medical information in the internet. But these are all ad hoc and dependent on a particular patient. Finally, also the division of labor and the rules, especially in case of the general practitioners on one hand and the hospital specialists on the other hand, are sources of problem themselves. What we see as the most pressing rules are pressures toward cost efficiency. While the division of labor is still regarded as foundationally sole responsibility for each doctor. These are, of course, simplifications, and we can all see that they are not so pure anymore. But basically, these pressures of short-term cost efficiency and the basic assumption of sole responsibility make it very difficult for these different activity systems to find common ground. So what we end up with is a path toward analysis of these activity systems and their internal contradictions as systemic phenomena that can only be changed by systemic action. Oops, now I did something wrong. The resolution of the contradictions requires a new instrumentality. By instrumentality, I mean a coherent repertoire of instruments plus a mentality for putting these instruments into use to attain, mold, and expand the object of the activity. And this mentality, the foundational quality of it must be will, that is, enacted transformative agency. That is something which still is not that widely understood when we think about competencies and expertise. So the second spearhead, as I see it, is what I call not working. Permanent teams are increasingly replaced by fluid combinations of expertise, knots that correspond to the problem at hand, which can be tied, untied, and retied together depending on the particular need. Work becomes pulsating movement of not working, rather than remaining in a stable team. And these knots are not reducible to any specific individual or organizational entity as the center of control. Typically, the center does not hold. Anyone who gets involved in a knot must be taking initiative. The locus of initiative and decision-making changes from moment to moment. Not working involves both rapid improvisation and long-term perspective of planning and following up. It is both fast and slow. And it operates by means of negotiation and flexible agreements in which the clients or patients are typically involved as equal parties. And it requires the creation of a shared language across the different actors. In other words, practitioners from different specialties and organizations involved in the care of the patient need to find a way to negotiate, coordinate, and combine their expertise in various points of the care trajectory. That's a big learning challenge. And I go back to the example of the patient which I showed to you. The events continue. This is actually a session of an intervention we call Change Laboratory, in which practitioners gather together around their shared patient to discuss the discoordinations and gaps in the care and how they might be overcome. And the discourse continued after what the patient told about herself. The chief physician in this situation, pointing at the document in front of her, says, "So, will you, the patient's personal general practitioner, be the first as the physician responsible for her at the primary care health center?" And then we will add, she's talking about signatures, putting their signatures on a document called care agreement. And consulting physician says, here we are kind of documenting what is already in place, but if we had a similar case where these contacts had not yet been created, this would serve as a sort of a model from which other patients could benefit. And the chief physician continues, it would be very important if we had a situation where the patient's personal physician is changed, the previous doctor would go on leave, and the next doctor would come for half a year. In such cases, this has great importance so that the doctor knows. And then people start signing, everybody signs except the patient. They forgot to give the document to the patient. So the chief physician finally interrupts and says, please let the patient also sign it while you're at it. From the signatures, one sees that there are several people involved. It's difficult, but it is possible. This kind of a document doesn't need to be a very complicated thing, but it means that it initiates a different mode of working that we call not working, which involves different modes of collaboration. The simplest version of this collaboration is simply coordination, following the script that has been jointly agreed upon, that each one has their fixed role and fixed tasks. More importantly, there are moments when cooperation is needed. In other words, they have to suspend the script and focus on the shared problem and actually jointly construct a solution. And then there are moments when they actually have to change the script itself, questioning and revising the way they work together, and we call that communication. And finally, there is a fourth one, which is rare, but which I like particularly, which I call carnivalization. When the participants who work together realize that it's time to basically just break it down and rethink. And this must take playful, artful forms of interaction. I recommend Jacques Tati's film Playtime. Half of the film is devoted to a new restaurant where people go for the opening night, and when they start dining, the restaurant starts falling apart. And all the diners get involved in trying to repair or rebuild the falling apart restaurant. I think that's pretty much what carnivalization is. It's also a very important aspect of human collaboration, neglected. The third spearhead, expertise as expansive learning. Overcoming those contradictions and engaging in not working requires learning something that is not yet there. In other words, there is no final answer, there is no a wise teacher who can hand it over to you. Expansive learning is collective creation, implementation, and acquisition of new patterns of activity. It's typically embedded in transformation efforts. And it's also not just learning in a vertical sense, it's also horizontal, sideways learning, struggle, negotiation, and hybridization among alternative perspectives. And it's collective concept formation in the wild. To put expansive learning among other forms of learning, this might be a helpful diagram. Traditional school learning is for something in the future. We tell the kids, yeah, you might not need this now, but you will in your life. You will need mathematics. So it's for the future, but it's based on exploitation of existing knowledge. Apprenticeship learning in a work setting is also based on exploitation of existing knowledge, existing skills, but it's for the current existing activity here and now. Now, various forms of problem-based or project-based learning, of course very well known in medical education, are based on exploration of new knowledge, but for an existing activity. They are not meant to radically transform the practice of medicine. They are meant to make it more inventive, innovative, and flexible. But when it comes to actually redesigning the activity itself for the future, we talk about expansive learning. And that's the type of learning which we have most difficulties with. It's not easy to understand and not easy to manage. It's a lengthy journey across the zone of proximal development. It proceeds by means of specific learning actions that form cycles of expansive learning. We can sometimes observe cycles of expansive learning which occur without deliberate intervention, but they are quite rare. So a methodology of formative interventions has been developed to trigger, support, and analyze cycles of expansive learning. The most well-known formative intervention method is called the change laboratory, and I already referred to it in this patient case. So this kind of summarizes a very simplified image of the steps of expansive learning. And these are, mind you, these are learning processes which typically take months. transformations of practice. And they begin with questioning. What is going wrong? Why are we doing this? In our studies of the care of patients with multiple chronic illnesses in Helsinki, we used the change laboratory interventions to tackle the fragmentation of care and to generate multiple cycles of expansive learning, in which practitioners and patients generated a new instrumentality called the care agreement, which I already referred to. Now, it's a very simple idea and the practitioners modeled it like this. You have these three basic activity systems, and typically their interaction is that primary care makes a referral and sends the patient to a hospital, and hospital someday, if you're lucky, sends back care feedback. Now, care agreement would say, why don't we get these all three together and agree on some basic ideas of the care and how we keep each other updated. So it's negotiated among the parties involved in the care of a patient with multiple chronic illnesses, including the patient, her or himself. It summarizes the diagnosis and key concerns of the different parties and outlines their plans of care. It also explicates the ways in which the different parties keep each other up to date when new developments occur and changes are made. It is signed by the key parties, including the patient, and it's supported by two additional instruments, which we call care map and care calendar of the patient. I showed earlier a couple of examples of the care maps. These are typically simple sheets of paper on which the patient and the doctor together sketch who are involved in this care and what are their interconnections, what might be also the missing interconnections. And the care calendar is something very simple too. Basically, we start talking about how did your present condition emerge and how has it developed over the past years. Now, I come to the final concluding slide and try to make some lessons from this. As I see it, medical education becomes co-responsible for shaping future medical practice, medical expertise. This means that all medical practitioners are medical educators. Of course, as it's been pointed out in this conference, also the patients are educators. Medical practice can only be shaped as a response to the needs of and in collaboration with the broader communities within which it is operating. And as I see it, a new prototype and platform of medical education will emerge necessarily, which you might call a transformation coalition between a target community, a healthcare organization, university, the learners, and other stakeholders. And there is already emerging genre of studies and literature on this type of coalitions. It probably means that medical education needs to start thinking of its own domain and its own site in broader terms than that are common today. The methodology of formative interventions, especially the change laboratory to which I just simply referred to, but I couldn't explain it in detail, may serve as a roadmap for building and analyzing such transformation coalitions. It is important that it's not something that you just do it. Theory is needed, but theory is not needed for the sake of the theory. It's needed for the sake of our own lives and future on this planet. Finally, this is a book from last year where much of this argument is presented in much more detail and grounded in empirical work. So if you're interested, it's easily available. And I would also like to advertise the the symposium that follows after this, I think even in this very location, where colleagues who are using activity theory and who are much more competent in medical education than I am are presenting, and I look forward to that very much. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have to finish this session at 9:15 on the dot. I'm just looking at Professor Harden to ask whether we have time for a question. Yes. So would anybody like to step forward to a microphone? But if you have a question, please keep it very short. Well, since nobody has stepped up to the microphone, I'd like to ask Yrjö one question. I heard the audience resonating to what you are saying. You've spoken about the difficulty of bringing about change. When people go back to their workplaces, have you got one tip, a word of advice about how they might start this process that you so elegantly described? Yrjö.
It's better to do it with a couple of friends. So look around who might be willing to join you. It's not a lonely road. Even just, for instance, if you want to start by studying some of the literature, some of this activity theory stuff, it's pretty hard. And we tend to be, as academics, use all kinds of jargon and so on. It's much nicer to sort of disentangle it together with a few friends.